Hey, Berkmar World History. Welcome back to another Digital Learning Day video lecture. Today we are going to be discussing the end of World War II as well as the beginning and the origins of the Cold War period, which basically begins right after the end of World War II. So some of this World War II information will be a little bit of a review, but I wanted to make sure that I went over some of this information before you had any questions you needed to clarify with your teachers. First of all, before we begin, I hope everyone's doing okay with their digital learning days, with their health, with their safety, and hopefully everyone's friends and families and everything is going well. And we're almost through with the semester, so just keep up with your work, and we will get through this all together. All right, so some more announcements. Make sure you're utilizing the Monday through Friday Google Meets to ask questions to teachers. We've posted this, or our teachers hopefully have posted this, but we are offering a ABC project for extra credit to help boost grades as well as prepare for the final exam. It will add 5 extra points to your overall grade, so just make sure if you're really interested in that and reviewing, there are directions as well as a second semester vocabulary and key term sheet. If your teacher has not posted those, make sure you reach out to your teacher. Um, we have a quiz coming up next Monday and Tuesday that will go over World War II. Also, that week, Wednesday and Thursday, you have your performance final, and then the final exam is scheduled for Wednesday, May 13th, and Thursday, May 14th. So, if you have any questions about the schedule or anything, just make sure you reach out to your individual teacher. All right, so today, remember, we're going to be discussing a little bit of World War II as well as some of the developments of the Cold War. And what I want you all to really focus on for today is after we get through going over some of the end of the war, I want us to make sure we really understand that the end of the war led to this new period called the Cold War, right? A lot of the developments that happened at the end of World War II, and you could argue even before World War II, led to this kind of 45-year period of tension known as the Cold War era. All right, so just real quick, World War II review. Remember, it's fought after World War I between 1939 and 1945. Remember, with World War II, you've got the Allies versus the Axis, and the main Allied forces were Great Britain, France, Soviet Union, United States, and Canada. Remember, Soviet Union actually signed a non-aggression pact, was trying to stay out of the war, signed an agreement with Hitler, and then Hitler surprise invaded the Soviet Union and kind of brought them into the war. So that's something to be reminding, and I'll bring that back up when we get to the origins of the Cold War. And then for the Axis forces, remember we have Germany, Italy, and Japan. Another key thing that I want you guys to remember about World War II is the war was fought in what was known as 2 theaters or geographic locations. Europe and North Africa is one of those areas where the war was primarily fought. And then the Pacific Ocean and the Pacific Islands is the second area. So early on in the war, probably from about 1939 to 1942, Germany was dominating and Italy were dominating. And they took over or had some sort of influence in every single place in Europe except for Great Britain and the Soviet Union. They were never able to officially take over all of those territories. They tried with the Battle of Britain, bombing Britain, but Britain never surrendered. And then there was a surprise attack at the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union were able to eventually push them back. And then same thing over here in the Pacific, you'll notice Japan was able to take over pretty much all of this Pacific area by 1942. Right. So early on in the war, you could say that the Axis powers looked like they were having a lot of success in taking over a lot of territory. Starting in 1942, we start to see some major turning points, both in Europe and the Pacific, right? And you can see essentially what happened in Europe is Italy and Germany essentially got surrounded. They got surrounded by this way, right? Mostly by Great Britain, the United States, and Canada with the D-Day invasion, right? They got surrounded this way by the Soviet push. This was a major Soviet win, Stalingrad, that allowed them to push back Germany. And then remember also there were some battles in North Africa that pushed the Axis powers back. And essentially what happened over time is they just got surrounded. You can see up here some major battles. This is posted as well in your e-class page. So if you'd like to go back and look at this presentation on your own, you're more than welcome to. All right. Same thing kind of happened in the Pacific, right? You had basically the Americans after Pearl Harbor developed a strategy known as island hopping, where they basically took island over island over island over island. And then look, if you see here, when the war officially ends in 1945, they had taken over some other islands very close to Japan. So they pretty much just pushed back the Japanese to Japan. Japanese did not surrender. They warned multiple times. The first bomb, still not to surrender. Second bomb, then that leads to surrendering. Okay, so Axis powers surrender in Europe first, not in Asia. So Italy surrendered actually in 1943. Germany surrenders later in 1945. And then the Axis powers in Japan and the Pacific don't surrender until August later that year, right, in 1945. So the war ends in Europe before it ends in the Pacific. And we're going to talk about these peace conferences a little bit, because these are very important at the end of World War II that lead to a lot of the tension known as the Cold War. And those two conferences are Yalta and Potsdam. Yalta conference happened while the war was essentially finishing in Europe. It looked like the Allied forces were pretty much going to win. So you'll notice that actually occurred in February of 1945, before Germany's surrender. And then if you look at Potsdam conference, right, that happened right before the bomb is dropped and the surrender of the Japanese. So Yalta and Potsdam, we're going to go over those two right now. Make sure you are aware of those two conferences. So what happened at Yalta, right? So the key issues were mostly focused on what was going on with Eastern Europe, also what to do with Germany. They wanted to create something to replace the League of Nations, and that will eventually be called the United Nations. And there was also some discussion of what the war, end of the war should look like in Japan, right? So this is a very famous picture over here, right? And the big three countries and the big three leaders, right? And we're going to go over those, right? But you can see here, the big three. This was the leader of Great Britain, and Winston Churchill. This was the leader of the United States, known as FDR, and then we all know him. He was the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, right? So these two guys had a lot more similarities, right? Democracy, capitalism. They had a lot more agreement, more friendly relationship, while Stalin kind of had more of this view of communism, dictatorship, right? So that is going to lead to some major problems for when these countries are talking about what the war and what the world should look like after World War II, which leads to the Cold War era, right? We're also going to see a shift in these leaders, right? Basically, Stalin wanted Poland and wanted some of those other Eastern European countries to kind of serve as like a buffer zone, because remember, with the Soviet Union, they did not want to be involved in World War I, right? The Bolsheviks, right? In World War II, they signed a non-aggression peace treaty, but yet they were dragged into both of these wars. So Stalin wanted to take over some land to protect the Soviet Union. And really, he wanted to take over that land to basically turn them into like communist dictator states. While these two countries wanted those countries to have like free elections, democracy, capitalism. So we start to see a divide over this. We also will see a divide of what happens in Germany. Remember, after World War I, Germany was kind of left to do its own thing with all the harsh punishments of Treaty of Versailles. They were able to rise up. Hitler, the rise of World War II. So what these countries decide to do is, instead of just leaving Germany able to do their own thing, they decide to divide Germany up. And we're going to go over this very quickly, because this is an extremely important part of the end of the war and the Cold War, right? So Germany was decidedly to be split up into 4 zones, right? The British zone, right? The French zone, the American zone, and the Soviet zone, right? But if you notice here, Berlin, which was the most important city of Germany, was located in the Soviet section, but the city of Berlin was also going to be divided up into these regions, right? So you had 4 different regions, right? The Soviet Union controlled the Berlin region, but Berlin was supposed to be divided into 4 zones. And this makes sense, right? France's border is close to here. The Britain border is close to there. The Soviet Union's closest to there. So that's why they divided them up. But this is important, because this will kind of be one of the first areas where we see some Cold War events happen in Berlin, because these countries are in such close proximity. Potsdam, remember, was the second conference, and you'll notice we still have the big three, but two of the big three have now changed, right? Great Britain, they elected a new prime minister named Attlee right here, okay? Right here, FDR died of polio complications, and so Truman replaces FDR. And then the only one that stays the same is Stalin. Stalin did not trust these guys. He did not have relationships with them like he had the other two. We'll talk about why this shift led to some disagreements. So remember, with Potsdam, the main thing you need to think about is how the war is going to end in Japan, right? That's the main thing that was discussed at Potsdam. The war was already over in Europe. Yalta had to do mostly with what that was going to look like. Potsdam is all about Japan, right? And this is the big thing that kind of is happening. During this conference, the United States tested their atomic bomb under the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos, New Mexico. They actually did a successful test, right? The United States thought that they were the only ones that knew about this test. It was a highly secretive test, highly secretive project for the development of this bomb. But Stalin actually had Soviet spies infiltrated the Manhattan Project. So Truman was not telling anybody about the bomb and about using the bomb. He thought that the United States was the only one that knew about the bomb, but Stalin had spies that had already infiltrated it. And so this is going to eventually lead to tensions as well, right? So we all know, though, that the war ends when the bombs are dropped, August 6th and August 9th. It's the only time in human history where atomic bombs have been used on populations during wartime. Now, you guys will learn more about that in U.S. history. All right, so with these two conferences in the end of World War II, we pretty much have the beginning of the Cold War period, right? Which we'll go over kind of what that means, right? But the Cold War was a bitter state of indirect conflict that existed between the U.S. and the Soviet Union for more than 4 decades after the end of the war. Ever since Russia adopted communism government after the Russian Revolution, the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union was fragile, right? So this goes all the way back to the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917. So you could argue the origins of the Cold War actually have to do with the rise of the Bolshevik and the Communist Party and whatnot, right? So here you go, another kind of brief definition for you guys. The Cold War period was a political and military tension after World War II between the powers of the Western Bloc, which was the United States and their capitalist allies, and the Eastern Bloc, which was the Soviet Union and their communist allies. The reason it's called a Cold War is because no major World War III ever emerged because of nuclear weapons. The United States will test weapons, the Soviet Union will test weapons. So they were the big enemies. They both had nuclear weapons. Neither one of them wanted to start a nuclear war. So because of that, it's called the Cold War. But yet there were wars that happened during the Cold War. You've heard of the Korean War. You've heard of the Vietnam War. There was the Afghanistan war between Russia and Afghanistan. There were some other coups and other things that happened in other wars. So the Cold War period did have wars. It just never emerged into a global war because of nuclear weapons. The main concepts to kind of really remember is democracy and capitalism versus totalitarianism and socialism, communism. The United States and their allies are going to try and spread democracy and capitalism and try and stop these concepts that the Soviet Union wanted to push, like totalitarianism and socialism, communism, from spreading. And really, the Cold War tensions really began. Yes, you could argue they began with the Bolsheviks and the rise of the Russian Revolution, the Communist Party, but they really began at Yalta and Potsdam at the end of World War II. So here you go. Here's a kind of map to show you guys. We will go over NATO and Warsaw Pact, but all the countries in blue were countries that kind of supported the United States vision and capitalism and democracy. All the countries in red were countries that supported more of the Soviet policy or were forced to adopt the Soviet policies of communism and totalitarianism. We're not going to go into a lot of China, but China is going to go through a communist revolution. You guys can see down here, Vietnam, okay, went through some of that stuff. You can see some countries in Africa, Cuba under Fidel Castro. So this is kind of the rise of global communism under the Soviet Union, and then the United States and their NATO allies trying to stop the spread of communism throughout the world. The gray countries are non-aligned, meaning countries that tried to stay neither kind of out of this period. All right, so at the end of the war, there were disputes about the futures of Germany. Germany was partitioned into 4 zones. Poland's government would be controlled by the Soviets until free elections. The United Nations rendered the Soviets outnumbered. Lastly, Stalin was very angry about not knowing about the atomic bomb, even though he kind of really already knew about it, right? So main thing you guys really need to remember about the Cold War period, really with as far as kind of the teams or the groups, is you had NATO, which was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was the United States and their global allies. And then in response to NATO, the Soviet Union is going to create what's known as the Warsaw Pact, which was basically the Soviet Union and the territories they took over as a communist kind of state. The Iron Curtain, you guys may reference that. This is that line right here. It was not actually a curtain or border, but that was kind of the line that separated communist Eastern Europe and more capitalist democratic Western Europe. So I know we kind of went through everything very, very quickly. So if you need questions or you have questions, you need more clarification, I've linked, or your teacher should have linked. If you want to, if it's not linked, you can just type in the Cold War in 7 minutes in YouTube. It's a great video that goes over a lot of these ideas and concepts. And then if you have any other questions, make sure you are emailing your teachers or going to the Google Meet sessions every Monday through Friday at 1 p.m. Right? Good luck with everything. Hopefully this made sense. If you do have any questions, you can go through this PowerPoint on your own. Like I said, stay safe. Keep up the good work. A lot of students are doing a great job. If you are struggling or behind, make sure you're utilizing those Flex Fridays to catch up on your work and stay the course. Hope everyone stays healthy and safe. And like Mr. Williams, our principal, always says, make sure you are always believing in the B. All right, go Berkmar, go Patriots. Have a nice day, everyone.